What Thomas Mercer was about to discover, beneath an abandoned shed on his uncle's property that had stood untouched since 1928, would unearth a Prohibition-era banking mystery and transform his struggling farm in ways he never thought possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The faded receipt for the bank loan payment fluttered in Thomas Mercer's weathered hands as he sat at his kitchen table, the harsh morning light illuminating yet another month where expenses outpaced income. At 34, this third-generation farmer had survived droughts, floods, and market crashes that would have broken most men. But the invisible pressure of mounting debt was proving harder to weather than any storm that had ever swept across his fields. Thomas's 80-acre family farm outside of Millbrook, Nebraska, had become both his pride and his prison. The modest two-story farmhouse where he'd grown up still contained the same furniture his grandparents had purchased decades ago. The dining room table where 3 generations of Mercers had shared meals now served as his makeshift office, covered with past-due notices, equipment repair estimates, and increasingly desperate attempts to restructure a debt that grew like weeds after a summer rain. The farmhouse windows remained uncurtained, offering expansive views of the surrounding fields that had sustained his family for generations. But lately, those same fields felt more like shackles than sustenance, tying him to a legacy he was failing to maintain, despite working from dawn until well past dusk every day of the week. His neighbors probably thought he was stubbornly clinging to outdated methods, but they had no idea how much research he'd done on modern agricultural techniques that remained frustratingly out of reach due to their prohibitive costs. Thomas's morning routine had evolved into a complex ritual of prioritizing which bills must be paid immediately versus which creditors could be placated with partial payments or promises. Then came the physical preparation for the day's labor, checking weather forecasts, planning irrigation schedules, and mapping out maintenance tasks that needed to be completed with equipment that was decades past its prime. His smartphone contained more supplier payment reminders than personal contacts, a digital monument to how thoroughly financial stress had isolated him from the social connections that rural communities were once known for. Michael Peterson at the Agricultural Extension Office had explained that this isolation was common among struggling farmers. But understanding the psychology didn't make the reality any easier to bear. The worst part wasn't the backbreaking labor or the uncertainty of each harvest. The worst part was the financial quicksand that threatened to swallow not just his livelihood but generations of family history. Even with careful management and living far below his means, the additional costs of running a small farm in an era of industrial agriculture consumed nearly all of his profits. Increasing fuel prices, rising costs for seed and fertilizer, and the constant battle to maintain aging equipment had created a mountain of debt that grew larger, despite his best efforts to chip away at it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas worked part-time as a mechanic at Donaldson's garage in town, one of the few skills he possessed that could earn supplementary income during the off-season. The work provided some additional cash flow to keep the farm operating, but the time away from his fields created its own problems, forcing him to work even longer hours when he returned home. His marriage to Rebecca Mercer had been another casualty of his financial struggles. They'd met at the county fair 8 years ago, both young and optimistic about building a life together on land that had sustained families for generations. Rebecca had been patient initially, embracing the challenges of farm life and finding creative ways to stretch their limited budget. But 3 years of failed harvests, mounting debts, and Thomas's increasing preoccupation with the farm's survival had gradually worn down her resilience. The breaking point had come during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for their 5th anniversary when a call from The bank had interrupted their meal with news that their loan restructuring application had been denied. Rebecca had watched silently as Thomas spent the remainder of their anniversary on the phone, pleading with the loan officer for alternatives. That night, she'd admitted that she felt like she was married to the farm rather than to him, watching their dreams of family and stability disappear beneath an avalanche of financial worries. The divorce had been finalized 14 months ago, taking with it not just emotional support, but also Rebecca's income as a part-time school nurse that had helped keep the farm afloat during lean months. Rebecca had been fair about the separation, but fair didn't change the reality that Thomas was now facing his battles entirely alone. With only his farm income and part-time mechanic work to sustain him, the stack of bills on his kitchen table told the story of his financial desperation with mathematical precision. Past due notices from the equipment financing company, a warning from the seed supplier about requiring payment before delivering for the next season, and increasingly concerned letters from the bank holding his mortgage and operating loans. Thomas had been researching the painful option of selling some of his acreage to pay down debts, a decision that would break a century-old promise to keep the Mercer farm intact, when the certified letter arrived from Harrington and Associates law firm. The thick, cream-colored envelope stood out dramatically among the collection notices and agricultural catalogs that usually filled his mailbox. The law firm's letterhead featured an address in Omaha, a city Thomas visited only when absolutely necessary for agricultural conferences or to meet with bank officials about his loans. His father had occasionally mentioned having relatives in Omaha, but those family connections had become increasingly vague as older generations passed away. Dear Mr. Mercer, the formal correspondence began. We regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle Harold Mercer on June 8th, as the sole beneficiary designated in last will and testament. You have inherited his property at 1425 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, Nebraska, including all buildings, land, personal property, and assets contained therein. Thomas read the letter 4 times before the words began to register as reality rather than some elaborate mistake. Great-uncle Harold, his grandfather's enigmatic older brother, who had occupied the margins of family stories for as long as Thomas could remember. He was the subject of whispered conversations that stopped when children entered the room. The mysterious relative who sent birthday cards containing crisp $20 bills from an Omaha address but never appeared at family gatherings or holiday celebrations. Family speculation about Harold's lifestyle had provided endless material for gossip during extended family reunions. Some relatives whispered about his connections to banking circles during the 1920s and his sudden departure from Millbrook shortly after the stock market crash of 1929. Others suggested involvement in less than legal activities during Prohibition that might explain his apparent wealth, despite the Great Depression. Thomas's most vivid memory of great-uncle Harold dated to his high school graduation 10 years earlier. Harold had appeared unexpectedly at the ceremony, dressed in an elegant suit that looked expensive even to Thomas's untrained eye, standing out among the other family members in their Sunday best. His presence had caused considerable surprise among relatives who hadn't seen him in several years. After the official ceremony, Harold had approached Thomas privately, drawing him away from the extended family group that was preparing for the traditional celebration dinner. His manner had been both warm and intensely serious, as if he were imparting information of critical importance that would only be understood years later. Thomas, he had said, using a formal address that somehow incorporated both respect and familiarity. You're choosing a path now that will demand everything from you. Farming isn't just a job, it's a battle against nature, markets, and sometimes your own doubts. Life will present you with challenges that will test not just your endurance, but your very soul. He had pressed a small, elegantly wrapped package into Thomas's hands with the ceremony of someone passing down a sacred family tradition. This is for when those battles feel impossible to win. Always remember that the most valuable assets are often hidden beneath years of neglect, waiting for someone persistent enough to look beyond the surface to find their true worth. Inside the package had been an antique pocket watch, its gold surface decorated with intricate engravings and the Mercer family crest. The inscription on the back read in elegant script, "Fortune favors the persistent." Thomas had treasured the watch throughout his early farming years, carrying it during planting and harvest as a talisman of family connection and agricultural heritage. However, during the darkest period 2 years ago, when drought had decimated his corn crop and left him unable to make his equipment payments for 3 months, Thomas had reluctantly taken the watch to an antique dealer in Omaha. The proprietor had examined it carefully before offering $3,800, describing it as a beautiful example of early 20th century craftsmanship, probably commissioned by a wealthy banker or businessman. Thomas had accepted the money without negotiation, using it to make critical loan payments, while promising himself he would somehow find a way to buy back Harold's precious gift. That promise remained unfulfilled, adding another layer of guilt to the complex emotions surrounding his family relationships and agricultural heritage. Now staring at this inheritance letter, Thomas felt a complicated mixture of emotions that he struggled to identify, let alone resolve. Guilt over selling Harold's meaningful gift competed with desperate hope that this unexpected inheritance might represent an escape from the relentless cycle of debt and inadequate income that defined his existence. The property in town, something he knew absolutely nothing about managing despite his interest in real estate that had never developed beyond idle browsing of listings he could never afford. The lawyer's letter provided minimal details but mentioned several intriguing elements that captured Thomas's attention despite his natural wariness about things that seemed too good to be true. The property had been unoccupied since Harold's hospitalization in April, was described as a modest residential dwelling with potential historical value, and contained personal effects and documentation that might have considerable significance to family history. The phrase "personal effects and documentation" sparked Thomas's curiosity about what kind of materials a secretive great-uncle might have accumulated during decades of minimal contact with the family. The practical challenges seemed overwhelming when Thomas began to consider them seriously. Managing a second property would require time he simply didn't have given the demands of the farm. The house would likely need repairs and maintenance after sitting vacant for months. Property taxes would become another financial obligation on top of his already precarious situation. Yet, when Thomas honestly assessed his current trajectory, the facts were undeniable and increasingly desperate. His farm was operating at an unsustainable loss, requiring annual cash infusions that depleted his remaining savings and increased his debt load. The aging equipment he relied on was becoming more expensive to maintain than replace, but replacement remained financially impossible. Despite his best efforts at conservation farming and efficiency improvements, Thomas remained just one equipment failure or severe weather event away from financial collapse, a situation that affected small family farms at disproportionately high rates despite their critical role in local food systems and rural economies. The inheritance offered something that had become increasingly rare in his life: options and possibilities rather than just survival strategies. Thomas's research into the Millbrook property revealed a modest single-story home built in the 1920s in what had become a quiet residential neighborhood near the small downtown area. The location would be convenient to his part-time work at Donaldson's garage, potentially allowing him to increase his hours during crucial periods. Most encouragingly, he discovered that the property included nearly half an acre of land, enough for a substantial garden that could supplement his income through the growing farmers market movement that had been developing in Millbrook over recent years. The combination of reduced commuting time and potential additional income source made the inheritance seem increasingly practical rather than merely sentimental. "I think I should at least look at the place," Thomas said aloud to his empty kitchen, the decision crystallizing as he reviewed the information about the property and its potential benefits. His current path offered little hope for meaningful improvement, while the inheritance at least provided the possibility of diversifying his income sources. Even if maintaining two properties proved impossible, the townhouse would provide an asset that could be sold to reduce his farm debt. For the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself to consider possibilities beyond mere survival. Though his farming experience and financial struggles had taught him to be cautiously pessimistic about anything that appeared to offer easy solutions, Thomas contacted the lawyer's office, explaining that he would visit the property the following day and discuss the inheritance details in person. He researched the property records, spoke with his bank about how a second property might affect his overall financial position, and began the complex process of reorganizing his farm tasks to allow for a day away from his fields. The preparation process revealed just how much his life had been constrained by his financial and operational needs. Every decision required careful consideration of weather forecasts, irrigation schedules, equipment maintenance timing, and ensuring that livestock needs would be met during his absence. The logistics of managing even a single day away from the farm required the kind of detailed planning that reminded Thomas of military operations he'd read about, though the stakes felt even more personal and immediate. On a bright June morning that promised sweltering heat by midday, Thomas loaded a few essential tools into his aging pickup truck, carefully securing them in the truck bed designed for hauling farm supplies rather than personal possessions. The drive from his farm to the Millbrook town center would take approximately 20 minutes, requiring careful planning to ensure he could return in time for afternoon irrigation work. As he departed the farm entrance, Thomas felt the familiar mixture of apprehension and reluctant hope that had become his constant companion since his financial difficulties began. The farm had been both his heritage and his burden, providing purpose and identity while trapping him in financial desperation and social isolation. He was trading a few precious hours of farm work for an unknown possibility, a gamble that would either improve his situation or complicate it beyond his ability to manage. "I'm actually doing this," Thomas said as he turned onto the main road toward town, his voice filled with a cautious optimism that he allowed himself only in small, carefully measured doses. "Dad always said Uncle Harold was eccentric but smart about money. Maybe he knew I needed a change exactly when I needed it most." Neither Thomas nor anyone in his family could have imagined that beneath a weathered shed floor in his uncle's backyard, concealed in a forgotten underground vault that hadn't been accessed since 1928, lay banking ledgers and rare currency worth $15 million. Hidden away during the banking panic before the Great Depression, these assets would transform Thomas's failing farm into something beyond his wildest dreams. The drive into Millbrook offered Thomas rare moments of observation that farming rarely allowed. The transition from sprawling agricultural land to the increasingly dense residential areas created a visual rhythm that contrasted sharply with his daily routine. Victorian houses from the town's early days stood alongside modest bungalows from the post-war building boom, creating an architectural timeline of the community's development. For a farmer whose daily focus rarely extended beyond his property boundaries, every mile closer to town represented another step into unfamiliar territory. What if the house required extensive repairs he couldn't afford? What if the property had hidden issues the lawyer's letter hadn't disclosed? What if this impulsive decision to spend precious time away from his fields proved to be another financial misstep that pushed him closer to foreclosure? Yet, despite these concerns and the disruption to his carefully planned schedule, Thomas found himself experiencing brief moments of unexpected anticipation as the rural landscape gave way to Millbrook's orderly streets. He had prepared methodically for this journey, bringing basic tools for initial inspection, important documents organized in a worn leather portfolio passed down from his father, and a carefully considered timeline that would allow him to return to the farm before his irrigation system needed adjustment. "Look at that," Thomas murmured as he turned onto Oakwood Lane and spotted number 1425. "It's actually not in bad shape." The observation was genuinely surprising. The modest craftsman-style home with its distinctive covered porch and tapered columns appeared well-maintained despite several months of vacancy. The yard showed signs of neglect, but the structure itself seemed sound, with no obvious damage to the roof or foundation. The immediate impression was of a property that had been cared for consistently over decades rather than subjected to haphazard maintenance. Unlike many vacant properties Thomas had observed around town, this house retained its dignity despite the encroaching weeds and overgrown shrubs. The neighborhood appeared stable and established, with well-maintained homes creating an atmosphere of modest prosperity rather than decline. The directions from Harrington and Associates led Thomas to a lockbox attached to the front door containing the house key. Using the code provided in their letter, he opened the small metal container and removed a surprisingly ornate brass key that seemed out of character with the home's otherwise practical appearance. Thomas paused before entering, practicing the deep breathing technique his father had taught him for staying calm during equipment breakdowns in the middle of harvest. The house was even more impressive inside, with original architectural details that had been carefully preserved and modern amenities seamlessly integrated without compromising the historical character. He stepped into the dimly lit entrance hall of what was now improbably his second property, feeling both like an intruder and a returning relative simultaneously. The interior of Harold's home revealed his great-uncle's sophisticated taste and unexpected affluence. The formal living room and dining area contained quality furniture that appeared to date from various periods, arranged with an eye for both comfort and aesthetic appeal. Hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, and period light fixtures created an atmosphere of understated elegance rather than ostentatious display. Framed photographs lined the hallway walls, showing Harold at various ages alongside people Thomas didn't recognize, men in banking attire, civic celebrations, and what appeared to be business associates rather than family members. Thomas moved through the rooms slowly, noting the careful maintenance and updating that had occurred over the decades. The kitchen featured modern appliances that had been selected to complement rather than clash with the home's 1920s origins. The bathroom had been renovated with similar attention to historical authenticity while providing contemporary functionality. Throughout the house, Thomas found evidence of Harold's methodical nature, labeled files containing home maintenance records, appliance manuals organized by date of purchase, and detailed documentation of every renovation and repair. This meticulous record-keeping seemed at odds with the family stories about Harold's mysterious past and sudden departure from Millbrook all those years ago. As Thomas continued his exploration, he discovered a small home office containing a roll-top desk that appeared to be an authentic antique rather than a reproduction. The desk was locked, but a thorough search of nearby drawers revealed a small key that opened it to display an immaculately organized workspace. Inside, he found neatly labeled folders containing property records, tax documents, and personal correspondence spanning decades. One folder labeled Family History contained photographs of Mercers from multiple generations, including several of Thomas himself at various ages, his high school graduation, working on the farm, even a recent newspaper clipping about sustainable farming practices that had featured him briefly. The realization that Harold had been quietly tracking his life while remaining distant created a complex mixture of emotions: surprise that he had been the subject of such attention, confusion about why Harold had maintained his distance, and a growing curiosity about the man who had quietly monitored his struggles from afar. In the bottom drawer, Thomas discovered an envelope addressed simply for Thomas in Harold's distinctive handwriting. The paper felt expensive and substantial, the kind used for formal occasions rather than everyday correspondence. With hands that trembled slightly from emotion rather than anxiety, Thomas opened the envelope to find a letter written in the same careful script he remembered from childhood birthday cards. "My dear grandnephew Thomas," the letter began. "If you are reading this, I have passed on and you have chosen to accept my modest gift. I hope you understand that this inheritance represents more than just a house and property. It is my attempt to provide you with the opportunity for a fresh perspective on the challenges you've been facing at the farm." Thomas read with increasing amazement as Harold outlined his awareness of the farm's financial difficulties, Thomas's divorce, and the increasingly precarious state of the family agricultural legacy. "By now, you've probably begun to realize that I've been more aware of your circumstances than you imagined. Please don't think of this as intrusion or meddling. Rather, consider it the attention of a family member who has always admired your dedication and perseverance, even from a distance." The letter continued, expressing Harold's admiration for Thomas's commitment to maintaining the family farm despite overwhelming odds, your determination to preserve the Mercer agricultural heritage, and your willingness to work beyond exhaustion to honor your father's and grandfather's legacy demonstrate the kind of character that I had always hoped existed in our family bloodline. This house has been my sanctuary for the past 40 years, but more importantly, it has been my connection to Millbrook and the family I left behind for reasons that seemed necessary at the time. I believe you will find that the property offers the kind of stable asset that might provide options you haven't considered in your current financial planning. The most intriguing paragraph came near the end. The property comes with everything you need to make informed decisions about your future, including documentation that may change your understanding of our family's history in this community. More importantly, the house contains secrets that may ensure the Mercer farm's survival for generations to come. Be patient, observant, and trust your instincts as you always have during planting and harvest. The most valuable assets are often hidden beneath years of apparent neglect, waiting for someone persistent enough to uncover their true worth. Remember what I told you at your graduation? Fortune favors the persistent. Beneath the signature was a postscript that caught Thomas's attention immediately. The pocket watch has always pointed toward true security. "In my shed, you'll find what others have overlooked since 1928. Our family has been connected to Millbrook's banking history in ways few remember today." Thomas read the letter twice, feeling profound gratitude for Harold's thoughtfulness combined with intense curiosity about the reference to secrets and valuable assets hidden on the property. What could his great-uncle have preserved that would ensure the farm's financial survival? Was he referring to investment accounts, property records, or something else entirely? Following the letter's subtle direction, Thomas made his way to the backyard where a weathered garden shed stood partially concealed by overgrown shrubs. The structure appeared far older than the house itself, with vertical board siding that had weathered to a silvery gray and a slightly listing stance that suggested decades of settling into the ground. Unlike the meticulously maintained house, the shed appeared deliberately neglected, as if Harold had intentionally avoided drawing attention to it. The door hung slightly askew on rusted hinges, secured by a padlock that showed more recent care, new and substantial despite the shed's decrepit appearance. Thomas searched the key ring the lawyer had provided, finding a small brass key that opened the padlock with surprising ease. The shed's interior was dim and dusty, containing the expected collection of garden tools, old paint cans, and miscellaneous hardware. But unlike the organized precision of the house, these items appeared haphazardly arranged, as if intentionally creating an impression of random storage rather than deliberate order. The space measured approximately 8 by 10 feet, with a dirt floor that had been partially covered with wooden planks of varying ages and conditions. A workbench ran along one wall, cluttered with tools that showed little evidence of recent use. Shelving units held containers of nails, screws, and garden supplies, all covered with layers of dust that suggested years of undisturbed storage. Thomas stood in the center of the shed, considering Harold's cryptic message. The pocket watch had pointed toward true security. What could that mean in this context? He recalled the gold watch's heavy feel, the ornate engraving on its surface, and the inscription about persistence. Something about the floor beneath his feet seemed uneven, with certain boards appearing more deliberately placed than others. Kneeling down, Thomas examined the wooden planks more carefully. Most appeared to be random scrap lumber, but a section measuring approximately 4 by 4 feet showed evidence of more careful construction. The boards there were of uniform width and fitted together with greater precision than the surrounding floor. Remembering Harold's meticulous nature evident throughout the house, this area of apparent carelessness seemed deliberately inconsistent. Thomas removed several tools from the workbench and began carefully prying up one of the boards in this section. It came away with surprising ease, revealing not dirt beneath, but what appeared to be a concrete surface. As Thomas removed more boards, he uncovered what was unmistakably a concrete pad with a metal ring embedded in its center. The ring appeared to be a lifting handle, the kind used for accessing underground storage or utility connections. Clearing away the remaining boards revealed a square concrete hatch approximately 3 feet on each side, with the metal ring positioned for lifting. The concrete appeared old but intact, with no evidence of cracking or water damage that might be expected after decades of exposure to ground moisture. Whatever lay beneath had been carefully engineered for long-term protection from the elements. Using a pry bar from Harold's workbench, Thomas carefully leveraged the concrete hatch upward. It moved with unexpected ease, suggesting hidden counterweights or a mechanical assistance system not visible from the surface. As the hatch swung upward and to the side, it revealed a metal ladder descending into darkness. Thomas retrieved a flashlight from his truck and cautiously approached the opening, directing the beam downward to reveal what appeared to be a small underground room with concrete walls. The space below was approximately 8 feet square, with a ceiling height that would allow most people to stand comfortably. The floor and walls were finished concrete, showing remarkable preservation for what must have been construction dating to the 1920s. Most surprisingly, the space was completely dry, suggesting sophisticated waterproofing techniques that had maintained their integrity for nearly a century. Thomas descended the metal ladder carefully, testing each rung before committing his weight. At the bottom, his flashlight revealed a space that defied his expectations entirely. Rather than rough storage, he found himself in what appeared to be a small but sophisticated vault. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, holding neatly organized document boxes, ledgers, and metal containers that resembled safe deposit boxes. A small desk and chair occupied one corner, with what appeared to be a logbook open as if its user had just stepped away momentarily rather than decades ago. The air felt surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of passive ventilation system had been incorporated into the construction. Thomas approached the desk first, examining the logbook that lay open there. The pages contained handwritten entries dated 1928, with the final entry on October 23rd, just days before the stock market crash that would trigger the Great Depression. The entries appeared to be records of items placed in storage, with notations about ownership, value, and something called recovery protocols that seemed to reference legal documents stored elsewhere. The handwriting matched samples of Harold's that Thomas had seen in the house, confirming his great-uncle's direct involvement with whatever this underground vault contained. Moving to the shelving units, Thomas examined the document boxes first. Each was labeled with meticulous precision: Millbrook Bank Records 1922 to 1928, Client Trust Documentation, Currency Reserve Inventory, Negotiable Securities, Private Holdings. Opening one labeled Contingency Planning, Banking Crisis, Thomas found detailed documents outlining procedures for safeguarding client assets in the event of widespread financial collapse. The papers included legal frameworks for returning assets to rightful owners after banking system restoration, property titles held in trust, and alternative currency arrangements that could function outside the conventional banking system. Another box contained ledgers, recording transactions related to something, called the Millbrook Preservation Trust, with Harold's name appearing as trustee, alongside several others Thomas didn't recognize. The trust appeared to have accumulated significant holdings in the years leading up to 1928, with explicit provisions for protecting assets from bank failures and market collapse. The most surprising discovery came in a series of metal containers resembling safe deposit boxes, each secured with small locks that matched a ring of keys Thomas found in the desk drawer. Opening the first box revealed something extraordinary: neatly stacked gold certificates and currency from the 1920s, preserved in pristine condition through the careful environmental control of the underground vault. Box after box contained similar holdings: rare currency notes, gold and silver certificates, uncirculated coins, and negotiable securities that had been carefully preserved for nearly a century. Each container included meticulous documentation of provenance, original ownership, and apparent legal status. Some were labeled as abandoned property, with documented attempts to locate heirs, while others carried designations like contingent trust holdings or secured client assets pending banking restoration. As Thomas continued his exploration, he discovered detailed records explaining the vault's purpose. According to Harold's documentation, he had served as assistant manager at Millbrook's First National Bank during the 1920s, recognizing early warning signs of financial instability. Harold and several senior bank officers had established contingency measures to protect certain assets from potential bank failure. This underground vault had been constructed in 1926 as part of that contingency plan, designed to preserve critical records and certain high-value assets that might otherwise be lost in a banking collapse. When financial conditions deteriorated in 1928, Harold had been tasked with securing these materials before the full crisis unfolded. The documentation indicated that the original plan had included provisions for returning these assets to the banking system once stability returned. However, the depth and duration of the Great Depression, followed by significant banking reforms in the 1930s, had complicated these plans. Many original account holders had relocated or passed away without heirs, while others had settled their claims through government-managed recovery programs without knowledge of these separately secured assets. Thomas sat at the small desk, attempting to process the implications of what he had discovered. Based on the documentation and his own knowledge of collectible currency from occasional farm auction visits, he was looking at holdings that likely carried not just face value but significant collector value given their rarity and pristine condition. The vault represented not just a historical curiosity but potentially substantial financial value, assets that had been preserved through the foresight of bankers who had anticipated the coming financial crisis but had never been able to fully implement their recovery plans as the economic situation deteriorated beyond their expectations. As evening approached, Thomas carefully secured the underground vault and returned to the house, his mind racing with the implications of his discovery. He would need expert assistance to properly evaluate the contents, legal advice regarding ownership questions, currency appraisers to determine value, and historical researchers to provide context for the documents. Harold's letter now made sense in ways Thomas couldn't have anticipated. The reference to secrets that may ensure the Mercer farm's survival wasn't exaggeration or sentimentality. It was a literal description of assets that could potentially resolve his financial challenges if properly authenticated and legally established as his inheritance. That evening, Thomas sat at his uncle's kitchen table surrounded by documents from the vault, feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's life. The immensity of his discovery contrasted sharply with his morning routine of counting pennies to keep his farm afloat. Somewhere between disbelief and cautious hope, he formulated a plan that would require expert guidance rather than hasty action. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Harold's property. Thomas had just finished inventorying another section of the vault when he heard vehicles approaching on the gravel driveway. He quickly secured the shed door and moved toward the house, his farming instincts automatically assessing the sound of multiple engines, at least two vehicles, one larger than the other. A silver sedan and a panel van with Millbrook Historical Society emblazoned on its side, parked near the front porch. A woman in her early 60s emerged from the sedan, dressed in a tailored suit that suggested professional authority. From the van stepped a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying what appeared to be specialized equipment. "Mr. Mercer?" the woman called as Thomas appeared on the porch. "I'm Elizabeth Harrington from Harrington and Associates. We spoke on the phone yesterday about your uncle's estate." She extended her hand in greeting. "This is Professor William Davidson from the Millbrook Historical Society and State University's Banking History Department." Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans before shaking hands with his visitors, acutely aware of the dirt under his fingernails from his morning's exploration. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow," he said, his farmer's directness masking his concern about their timing. "We received your message about finding historically significant materials and thought it prudent to respond promptly," Elizabeth explained. Harold was a significant benefactor of the Historical Society, and Professor Davidson worked closely with him on several research projects. This revelation that Harold had been actively involved with historical research added another layer to Thomas's evolving understanding of his mysterious great-uncle. "You knew my uncle well?" he asked, directing the question to Davidson. "For over 15 years, the professor confirmed." Harold was exceptionally knowledgeable about Millbrook's banking history during the 1920s. His research contributions have been invaluable to our understanding of how rural communities navigated the financial turbulence preceding the Great Depression. Thomas hesitated, calculating the risks and benefits of sharing his discovery with these unexpected visitors. His farming experience had taught him to be cautious with newfound opportunities, but also to recognize when expert assistance was essential. "I think you'll want to see what I found yesterday," he finally said, gesturing toward the shed. Leading them across the overgrown yard, Thomas explained his discovery of the underground vault and its contents. Professor Davidson's expression shifted from polite interest to intense excitement as Thomas described the ledgers, currency, and documentation he had found. "If what you're describing is authentic," Davidson said, his voice quickening with academic enthusiasm, "this could be one of the most significant discoveries in Midwestern banking history. There are substantial gaps in our understanding of how local bankers responded to early warning signs of the 1929 crash, particularly their contingency planning." At the shed, Thomas removed the padlock and showed them the concealed hatch. "I've only examined about a third of what's down there," he explained. "Most of it seems to be financial records and currency that was secured before the crash." Professor Davidson knelt beside the opening, his expression reverent as he shined his flashlight into the vault. "This is extraordinary craftsmanship," he observed. "The waterproofing techniques and ventilation system explain the remarkable preservation conditions." "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the ladder. Thomas nodded, and the professor descended with surprising agility for his age. Elizabeth remained above ground, her expression calculating as she watched Thomas. "You understand this discovery has potentially significant implications," she said carefully, "both historically and financially." "I'm beginning to," Thomas replied, maintaining the measured tone that had served him well in difficult negotiations with equipment dealers and bank officers. "What I don't fully understand are the legal aspects. Does this all belong to me as Harold's heir, or are there ownership complications?" Elizabeth's assessment seemed to shift as she recognized Thomas wasn't naively proceeding without considering the legal ramifications. "Based on my preliminary understanding, the contents would be considered part of Harold's estate and therefore part of your inheritance. However, the provenance of specific items might raise questions that require detailed examination. Below, Professor Davidson's exclamations echoed up from the vault as he discovered particular documents or artifacts. His academic excitement provided a counterpoint to the lawyer's measured practicality and Thomas's cautious optimism. "Your uncle contacted our firm 6 months ago to update his will," Elizabeth continued. "He was quite specific about you being his sole heir and mentioned historical assets that would require proper handling. He arranged for Professor Davidson to serve as a historical consultant to the estate if necessary." This revelation that Harold had carefully arranged for expert assistance, even before his death, suggested a level of planning that went beyond simple inheritance. He hadn't just left Thomas property. He had constructed a support system for managing whatever Thomas might discover. Professor Davidson emerged from the vault clutching several ledgers, his face flushed with academic excitement. "This is even more significant than you realized," he said, carefully placing the books on a clean tarp Thomas had spread nearby. "These aren't just random records. They're a systematically preserved archive of the Millbrook First National Bank's contingency operations." Opening one ledger, Davidson pointed to entries dated September 1928. "Look here, these entries document the legal framework they created for securing select assets outside the conventional banking system. Harold and several senior bank officers anticipated the crash and created this vault as a form of protected reserve." "Is that legal?" Thomas asked, the question reflecting both his practical nature and his concern about his great-uncle's reputation. "Remarkably, yes," Davidson replied. "They created a separate legal trust structure called the Millbrook Preservation Trust that operated alongside the bank but remained technically independent. The documentation shows they informed regulatory authorities of its existence, though they kept its specific location confidential." Elizabeth leaned closer to examine the ledger. "This explains some of the unusual trust documents in Harold's legal files. The structure was designed to protect certain assets from bank failure while establishing clear ownership records and recovery protocols." "What about the currency and securities?" Thomas asked, thinking about the metal boxes still secured in the vault. "That's where this becomes particularly interesting," Davidson said, his academic demeanor barely containing his excitement. "Based on what I've seen, much of the currency was removed from circulation through legal purchases before the crash, specifically because Harold and his colleagues recognized its potential future value beyond face value. They were collecting rare currency deliberately." Thomas asked, the concept of numismatic investment seeming incongruously modern for rural bankers in the 1920s. "Precisely," Davidson confirmed. "The ledgers indicate they specifically targeted certain series and denominations already becoming scarce in circulation. They were essentially creating a high-grade currency collection under the auspices of the Preservation Trust. Over the next several hours, Professor Davidson conducted a preliminary inventory of the vault's contents, while Elizabeth reviewed the legal documentation. Thomas observed their work with growing appreciation for Harold's foresight and meticulous planning. What had initially appeared to be a mysterious secret was revealing itself as a carefully constructed legacy with both historical and financial value. "Based on my initial assessment," Davidson reported as they gathered in Harold's kitchen later that afternoon, "the vault contains approximately 1,200 rare currency notes, primarily gold and silver certificates from the 1880s through 1920s, all preserved in near-mint condition. There are also several complete collections of national banknotes from regional institutions that no longer exist." "And the estimated value?" Thomas asked, attempting to keep his voice steady despite the implications for his farm's future. Davidson and Elizabeth exchanged glances before the professor answered. "For insurance purposes, I would conservatively estimate the numismatic value at between $12 and $15 million, depending on current market conditions and authentication results." The figure momentarily robbed Thomas of speech. His entire farmland, equipment, and buildings combined was worth less than $1 million on paper, and considerably less in practical selling terms in the current agricultural market. That figure reflects only the currency collection, Davidson continued. The historical documents have separate academic value that major institutions would likely fund for preservation and research access. Elizabeth added her legal perspective. The documentation I've reviewed appears to establish clear title through the Preservation Trust structure, which officially dissolved in 1945 with all unclaimed assets legally transferring to Harold as the last surviving trustee. His will then transfers ownership to you without restriction. What should my next steps be? Thomas asked, his farmer's pragmatism reasserting itself despite the staggering figures being discussed. Secure professional authentication and appraisal, Davidson recommended immediately. I can arrange for specialists from the State University's numismatic department and the Federal Reserve's Historical Division to examine the collection. And comprehensive insurance coverage should be arranged immediately, Elizabeth added. I would recommend relocating the most valuable items to secure storage while the authentication process proceeds. Thomas nodded, mentally calculating the immediate needs at his farm against the timeframe for properly handling this discovery. How long would the authentication process take? He asked. For a collection of this magnitude, likely 3 to 4 weeks, Davidson estimated. Proper documentation, high-resolution photography, and verification would require methodical processing. Given the exceptional preservation conditions, I anticipate minimal complications. As the conversation continued, Thomas learned that Harold had been more than just a passive collector or former banker. His uncle had become a respected researcher in banking history, publishing several academic papers on financial practices during the 1920s and serving as a consultant to regional museums developing exhibits on the Great Depression's impact on rural communities. Your uncle was extraordinarily knowledgeable about currency valuation, Davidson explained. He could identify printing variations and rarities that even experienced collectors might overlook. The collection reflects both historical preservation and remarkably prescient investment strategy. The discussion extended into practical considerations, secure transport arrangements, specialized insurance policies, and confidentiality agreements that would protect the discovery while authentication proceeded. Throughout, Thomas maintained the careful attention to detail that had sustained his farming operation despite increasingly adverse conditions. Professor, Thomas asked as the meeting concluded, why would Harold keep this collection hidden all these years? If it's as valuable as you suggest, he could have benefited from it during his lifetime. Davidson considered the question thoughtfully. Based on my conversations with him over the years, Harold viewed himself as a steward rather than an owner. He believed these materials represented not just financial value, but historical significance that deserved proper context and timing. He also mentioned several times that he was waiting for the right moment to address certain family obligations, Elizabeth added. In retrospect, I believe he was referring to your situation at the farm. This perspective reinforced what Thomas was beginning to understand about his great-uncle, that far from being the mysterious recluse of family legend, Harold had been thoughtfully observing and planning for family needs while pursuing significant historical research and preservation work. As evening approached, arrangements were made for security personnel to monitor the property overnight while specialized transport was organized for the following day. Professor Davidson would return with authentication experts, while Elizabeth would prepare the necessary legal documentation to establish chain of custody and ownership verification. After his visitors departed, Thomas returned to the farmhouse that had been his childhood home, driving the familiar roads with an unfamiliar sense of possibility rather than resignation. The farm that had seemed increasingly unsustainable that morning now represented not a burden to be reluctantly Abandoned, but a legacy that might be rejuvenated with proper investment and modernization. His neighbor, Frank Wilson, was checking the irrigation equipment when Thomas pulled into the driveway. "Thought you'd be gone all day," Frank called as Thomas parked near the barn. "Everything okay at your uncle's place?" "Better than okay," Thomas replied, suddenly aware of the need for discretion until the collection was properly secured. "Just more to sort through than I expected. Looks like I might be splitting my time between here and town for the next few weeks." Frank nodded with the understanding of someone who had managed complex agricultural operations for decades. "Sarah and I can keep an eye on your irrigation schedules if you need to be away. Weather forecast looks stable for the next 10 days anyway." This offer of neighborly assistance, something Thomas had always provided to others but rarely accepted for himself, suddenly highlighted how isolation had become his default response to increasing financial pressure. "I'd appreciate that," he said, breaking his pattern of self-sufficiency. "There might be some opportunities coming up that require my attention elsewhere." That evening, as Thomas reviewed his farm accounts that had seemed so hopeless just 24 hours earlier, he found himself thinking differently about the numbers. The column showing equipment replacement needs now looked like an investment opportunity rather than an insurmountable obstacle. The irrigation system upgrade that would reduce water consumption by 40% became a practical improvement rather than an impossible dream. Most significantly, the threatening letter from his primary lender regarding the operating loan due for renewal in 60 days transformed from a potential foreclosure notice to a negotiation opportunity. With proper verification of his inheritance, he could potentially restructure his debt entirely, converting high-interest operating loans to more favorable terms that reflected his changed circumstances. Thomas placed his father's worn ledger book alongside one of Harold's meticulously maintained records from the vault. The contrast was striking, his father's entries showing the increasingly precarious position of a family farm, fighting against industrial agriculture's economies of scale, while Harold's demonstrated the power of foresight, careful planning, and strategic preservation of value through changing economic conditions. There was wisdom in both approaches, Thomas realized. His father's persistence had maintained the family legacy against increasingly difficult odds, while Harold's strategic thinking had created resources that might now ensure that legacy's continuation. The challenge would be integrating these perspectives, honoring the farming tradition while implementing the financial strategies his education had never provided. The following morning, Thomas rose before dawn as always, completing his essential farm tasks with the efficiency of decades of practice. But as he worked, his mind was mapping out the coming weeks with a methodical approach that would have made both his father and Harold proud. By mid-morning, he had returned to the town property where he found Professor Davidson already waiting with 3 colleagues from the university's authentication department. The specialists had brought specialized equipment for documenting the collection: high-resolution cameras, precision scales, specialized lighting, and reference materials for verification. "We'll begin with a complete photographic inventory," explained Dr. Eleanor Chen, the lead authentication specialist. "Each item will be documented, measured, and preliminarily categorized before detailed examination. Given the collection size, we'll work in systematic stages." Throughout the day, Thomas observed the authentication process with growing appreciation for both the collection's significance and Harold's foresight in preserving it so carefully. The specialists frequently commented on the exceptional condition of items that would normally show significant deterioration after decades of storage. "The environmental control in that vault is remarkable," Dr. Chen noted as she examined a series of gold certificates. "Consistent temperature, humidity control, protection from light exposure. These conditions have preserved items that would typically show significant foxing and paper degradation." By late afternoon, the team had completed preliminary documentation of approximately 1/4 of the collection, focusing on the rarest and most valuable items first. Their initial findings confirmed Professor Davidson's valuation estimates, with several items proving even more valuable than initially projected due to their exceptional condition and rarity. This 1882 gold certificate is one of perhaps 20 known to exist in this condition, Dr. Chen explained, showing Thomas a note with distinctive brown seal and serial numbers. The current auction record for a comparable example was $287,000 last year. Similar revelations continued as the examination proceeded, with multiple items valued in the six-figure range and dozens more conservatively worth tens of thousands each. The aggregate value was accumulating toward Professor Davidson's estimate with each authenticated piece. Elizabeth Harrington arrived mid-afternoon with insurance documentation and secure transport arrangements. "The armored carrier will arrive tomorrow morning," she informed Thomas. "We've arranged for temporary secure storage in the university's special collections vault while authentication continues." As Thomas signed the necessary paperwork, Elizabeth provided an update on her legal research. "I've completed preliminary verification of the trust documentation. The structure was indeed properly registered with state banking authorities in 1926, with appropriate regulatory disclosures filed through 1945, when final dissolution transferred remaining assets to Herald." This confirmation further solidified Thomas's legal position, establishing clear provenance for the collection and unambiguous ownership through Herald's estate. The inheritance that had seemed like an unexpected complication in his already challenging situation was rapidly transforming into the foundation for a secure future. That evening, after the authentication team had departed with plans to return the following day, Thomas sat on Herald's porch watching the sunset over Millbrook's modest skyline. The day's revelations had created a strange dichotomy in his circumstances. His farm remained in the same precarious financial position it had occupied for years, but his overall situation had fundamentally transformed. The pocket watch that had pointed toward true security had indeed fulfilled Herald's cryptic suggestion, though not in the way Thomas could have possibly imagined. The inscription, "Fortune favors the persistent," seemed less like generic encouragement and more like specific guidance for this exact moment. Persistence in searching the property had revealed the vault, and persistence in farming had preserved the legacy that Herald had apparently been determined to sustain. As darkness settled over the quiet neighborhood, Thomas made a decision that honored both his farming heritage and his great-uncle's strategic foresight. The farm would continue, but not through desperate struggle against impossible odds. Instead, it would transform into a sustainable operation through careful investment, modernization, and strategic planning that reflected both Herald's financial wisdom and Thomas's agricultural knowledge. The persistent Mercer farming tradition would continue, not as a battle against changing economic realities, but as an evolution that preserved what mattered most while adapting to ensure its survival for generations to come. 3 months after discovering the underground vault, Thomas stood in the middle of his cornfield watching as the new irrigation system was installed. High-efficiency sprinklers with moisture sensors and automated controls would reduce water usage by nearly 40%, while improving crop yields. The field that had struggled with uneven watering for years would now receive precisely calibrated moisture distribution based on soil conditions and weather forecasts. Nearby, 2 technicians were completing the installation of solar panels on the south-facing barn roof, another investment that would substantially reduce the farm's operating costs while aligning with Thomas's commitment to sustainable agriculture. The renewable energy system would power not only the new irrigation equipment, but also the upgraded grain storage facilities that had replaced the deteriorating bins his grandfather had built in the 1960s. "Never thought I'd see the day," remarked Frank Wilson, who had stopped his truck at the field's edge to observe the transformation. "Mercer Farm going high-tech. Your dad would have been skeptical at first, but I think he'd be mighty impressed once he saw the results." Thomas smiled at his neighbor's assessment. Dad always said the best farmers adapt or disappear. He just never had the capital to make the adaptations he knew were needed. He watched as the installation crew tested a section of the irrigation system, the precise water distribution creating a perfect rainbow in the late summer sun. The authentication process for Harold's collection had proceeded exactly as Professor Davidson had predicted. After 4 weeks of meticulous documentation and verification, the final valuation had settled at $14.7 million, slightly higher than the initial estimate due to several exceptionally rare specimens discovered in the later stages of the inventory. With Elizabeth Harrington's guidance, Thomas had established the Mercer Agricultural Heritage Trust, a legal structure that accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. The trust owned the currency collection, managed its gradual and strategic transition to market to maximize returns, and channeled those resources into both farm modernization and long-term financial security. The farmhouse renovations should be finished next week, Thomas told Frank as they walked toward the new equipment shed that had replaced the dilapidated structure where Thomas had previously struggled to maintain aging machinery. Contractors are installing the energy-efficient windows and updating the electrical system today. Inside the shed, the contrast between past and future was striking. Thomas's father's ancient tractor stood beside a new model with GPS guidance, precision planting capability, and computerized monitoring systems. The old machine would remain operational. Thomas insisted on maintaining certain traditional farming practices alongside the modernization, but the heavy daily work would now be handled by equipment that reduced both fuel consumption and operator fatigue. "How's the schedule looking for the co-op formation?" Frank asked, referring to the initiative Thomas had launched that was transforming relationships among neighboring farmers. "First organizational meeting is next Thursday at the community center," Thomas replied. "We've got 17 farms committed to participation so far. The shared equipment program should be operational before harvest season." This cooperative approach represented perhaps the most significant transformation in Thomas's agricultural philosophy. Rather than each small farm struggling independently against the economics of industrial agriculture, the Millbrook Agricultural Cooperative would allow participants to share specialized equipment, coordinate crop planning for improved market leverage, and implement collective soil management practices that benefited the entire community. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove into town for his weekly meeting with Professor Davidson, who had become both mentor and partner in managing Harold's historical legacy. The university's Special Collections Department had created a dedicated research facility to house the portion of the collection donated for educational purposes, with Thomas retaining ownership of the most valuable pieces while providing scholarly access. The Millbrook Banking History Center, funded through a combination of university resources and a grant from the Mercer Agricultural Heritage Trust, had already attracted visiting researchers from across the country. The materials preserved in Harold's underground vault had indeed proven to be historically significant, filling important gaps in understanding how rural communities had navigated the financial turbulence of the late 1920s. The conservation team has completed digitization of the first 1,000 pages, Davidson reported as they toured the climate-controlled research room where graduate students were carefully handling ledgers and correspondence from the vault. The digital archives will be available to researchers nationwide by the end of the month. Thomas observed the preservation work with growing appreciation for his great-uncle's foresight. Harold had recognized the historical value of these materials when others saw only financial records to be discarded. His meticulous preservation had maintained not just their physical condition, but their contextual relationships that made them so valuable to researchers. "We've had 3 academic institutions contact us about establishing similar regional banking history centers," Davidson continued. "Your decision to make these materials accessible rather than keeping them private has created something of a movement in historical preservation circles." This educational impact represented an unexpected dimension of Harold's legacy, one that extended beyond financial value to create lasting contributions to historical understanding. Thomas had discovered that this aspect of the inheritance brought a different kind of satisfaction than the material improvements to his farming operation. From the university, Thomas drove to Harold's house, now his town residence, where renovation work was also underway. The property was being carefully updated with modern conveniences while preserving its historical character, creating a comfortable second home that honored both its 1920s origins and Harold's meticulous stewardship. The garden shed that had concealed the underground vault had been converted into a proper entrance structure, with the vault itself now properly ventilated and illuminated as a private museum space. Thomas had retained certain historically significant pieces that held personal meaning, displaying them in museum-quality cases with proper documentation of their significance. Elizabeth Harrington was waiting in the living room, surrounded by legal documents spread across the coffee table. "Perfect timing," she said as Thomas entered. "The paperwork for the Community Foundation is ready for your signature." The Millbrook Community Development Foundation represented the third component of Thomas's strategic plan for Harold's legacy. Beyond securing his own farm's future and preserving the historical materials, Thomas had established a foundation that would support agricultural education, rural small business development, and community infrastructure improvements throughout the region. "The initial grant program will open for applications next month," Elizabeth explained as Thomas reviewed the documentation. "We've structured it to prioritize sustainable agriculture initiatives, small-scale food processing facilities, and educational programming that supports the next generation of family farmers." This aspect of Harold's legacy perhaps most clearly reflected Thomas's own values, taking resources that could have been used solely for personal benefit and deploying them strategically to strengthen the broader agricultural community. The foundation would provide resources for neighboring farms to implement some of the same improvements Thomas had made, creating a more resilient local food system rather than just a single successful operation. As evening approached, Thomas returned to the farmhouse that had been his childhood home, now transformed through thoughtful renovation rather than desperate maintenance. The worn kitchen table where he had once sorted unpayable bills had been refinished but retained a tangible connection to his father's perseverance through increasingly difficult farming conditions. Sitting at that table, Thomas reflected on the remarkable transformation of the past 3 months. The discovery of Harold's underground vault had indeed changed his financial circumstances dramatically, but the true value of the inheritance lay in the opportunities it created rather than merely the assets it provided. His farm had evolved from a struggling operation on the verge of foreclosure to a demonstration site for sustainable agricultural practices that balanced tradition with innovation. The modernization hadn't abandoned his family's farming heritage, but had created the conditions for that heritage to continue and thrive in changing circumstances. More significantly, Harold's legacy had provided the means to strengthen not just the Mercer farm, but the broader agricultural community. The equipment cooperative, educational programs, and community foundation were creating resilience that extended beyond property boundaries to benefit farmers throughout the region. The following morning, Thomas hosted a visit from the State Agricultural Extension Office, whose representatives were documenting his irrigation and renewable energy systems as case studies for other farmers. The transition from struggling farmer to agricultural innovator remained somewhat surreal, but Thomas found himself increasingly comfortable in this unexpected role. "What impresses me most," commented Dr. Sarah Johnson, the Extension Office's director, "is how you've balanced modernization with traditional practices. Too often we see farms either rejecting new technology entirely or abandoning proven methods in favor of untested approaches." This balanced perspective reflected Thomas's evolving understanding of agricultural sustainability, honoring traditional knowledge while embracing appropriate innovation. maintaining independence while fostering community cooperation, preserving heritage while adapting to changing conditions. 6 months after discovering the underground vault, Thomas hosted the first harvest celebration for the Millbrook Agricultural Cooperative. Farmers who had previously worked in isolation gathered at the Mercer farm to share a meal and celebrate the completion of their first coordinated crop planning and marketing season. Tables set up in the newly renovated barn held dishes prepared from locally grown produce, while children played in the open space where outdated equipment had once been stored. The atmosphere combined the traditional community spirit of rural harvest celebrations with the collaborative energy of a successful new venture. "I'd like to propose a toast," Frank Wilson announced, raising his glass as the conversations quieted. To Thomas Mercer, who could have taken his inheritance and left farming behind entirely. Instead, he chose to reinvest in this community and reimagine what family farming can be in the modern era. The gathered farmers raised their glasses in agreement, many of them operating with new equipment accessed through the cooperative or implementing improved practices funded through the Community Foundation's grant programs. The collective impact of these changes extended far beyond what any individual farm could have achieved in isolation. As Thomas acknowledged the toast with characteristic modesty, he thought about how Harold's legacy had rippled outward in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The financial resources discovered in the underground vault had indeed secured the Mercer farm's future, but their deployment had strengthened an entire agricultural community. A year after inheriting Harold's property, Thomas stood in his cornfield as harvest equipment moved efficiently through rows of healthy plants. The previous season's yield had exceeded county averages by 23% while using substantially less water, fuel, and chemical inputs than neighboring operations. The financial performance was undeniable, but Thomas took greater satisfaction in the sustainability improvements that would preserve the land's productivity for future generations. The farm that had once teetered on the edge of foreclosure now represented a model of what small-scale agriculture could achieve when proper resources and innovation were applied to traditional farming knowledge. Visiting agricultural students from the state university regularly toured the operation, learning how principles of ecological farming could be integrated with appropriate technology. That evening, Thomas sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sunset over fields that his family had worked for generations. The pocket watch that had once been sold out of necessity now rested in his hand, recovered from the antique dealer through a fortunate coincidence, and restored to its rightful place in the Mercer family legacy. The inscription, "Fortune favors the persistent," caught the fading sunlight as Thomas considered how differently he now understood those words. Persistence wasn't merely enduring hardship or clinging to tradition regardless of consequences. True persistence meant adapting while maintaining core values, finding new paths forward when old routes became impassable, and recognizing that preserving a legacy sometimes required reimagining its form rather than simply repeating its patterns. Harold's underground vault had contained financial treasure that transformed Thomas's material circumstances, but the true inheritance had been the example of foresight, adaptability, and strategic thinking that his great-uncle had demonstrated. The banker who had anticipated financial crisis and preserved value through changing conditions had provided not just resources but a model for navigating an agricultural landscape that was experiencing its own form of systemic transformation. 2 years after the discovery beneath the garden shed, Thomas welcomed a group of young farmers participating in the Mercer Agricultural Mentorship Program, an initiative funded through the Community Foundation. These beginning farmers, many from non-agricultural backgrounds, were learning sustainable farming practices through hands-on experience at established operations throughout the county. "Farming has always been about managing change," Thomas explained as they toured fields where cover crops grew between main crop seasons, building soil health and reducing erosion. Weather patterns, market conditions, technological developments, The most successful farmers have always been those who could adapt while honoring what previous generations learned through experience. This philosophy of balanced adaptation had become the hallmark of Thomas's approach to agricultural leadership, respecting tradition while embracing innovation, maintaining independence while fostering cooperation, preserving heritage while evolving practices. The underground vault's discovery had provided financial resources, but Thomas's deployment of those resources reflected wisdom that money alone couldn't buy. As the young farmers peppered him with questions about irrigation scheduling, soil biology, and equipment sharing arrangements, Thomas recognized something his father and Harold would have appreciated: the continuation of agricultural knowledge across generations, adapted for changing conditions, but maintaining core principles of stewardship and community. 5 years after inheriting his great-uncle's property, Thomas stood before the newly completed Millbrook Agricultural Research and Education Center, a collaborative facility established through partnership between the Community Foundation, the State University, and participating farms. The center would provide technical training, conduct field research on sustainable practices, and serve as headquarters for the now thriving agricultural cooperative. This center represents our community's commitment to the future of family farming, Thomas said during the dedication ceremony. Not by clinging to the past, but by honoring its wisdom while embracing the innovations that will allow sustainable agriculture to thrive in changing conditions. The audience included farmers who had once operated in isolation, but now coordinated crop planning, equipment usage, and marketing strategies through the cooperative structure. It included researchers developing region-specific sustainable farming methods adapted to local soil and climate conditions. It included young people pursuing agricultural careers through educational programs that combined traditional knowledge with cutting-edge practices. Most meaningfully for Thomas, it included Rebecca Mercer, now Rebecca Thompson, who had returned to Millbrook with her husband to operate a small, specialty crop farm supported through the cooperative's shared resources. Their reconciliation as friends and colleagues represented another form of growth that the past 5 years had made possible, transforming past disappointment into new forms of connection and collaboration. As Thomas looked out over the gathered community, he reflected on how differently Harold's legacy had manifested than anyone could have predicted. The underground vault had indeed contained financial treasure that transformed Thomas's material circumstances, but the true value had emerged through how those resources were deployed, strengthening not just one farm, but an entire agricultural community, preserving not just one family's legacy, but a regional tradition of farming. The persistence celebrated in the pocket watch's inscription had proven to be not merely individual endurance, but collective resilience, the capacity of a farming community to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining its essential character and purpose. Thomas had discovered that the most valuable assets were indeed hidden beneath years of apparent neglect, but they included not just financial resources but the wisdom, cooperation, and stewardship that had sustained rural communities through generations of change. The Mercer farm continued to thrive, not as an isolated success story, but as part of a rejuvenated agricultural ecosystem where small and medium-sized operations supported each other through shared resources, knowledge exchange, and collective marketing. The financial security provided by Harold's collection had created the foundation, but the lasting legacy was the community of mutual support that had grown from that initial investment. As Thomas concluded his remarks at the center's dedication, he shared the perspective that had emerged from his unexpected journey. True wealth isn't measured merely in financial assets, but in the resilience of communities, the health of the land, and the wisdom passed between generations. My great-uncle understood that preserving value sometimes means hiding it from immediate view until the right moment for its discovery and deployment. His greatest gift wasn't the treasure itself, but the vision to see how it might create possibilities beyond any individual's benefit. That evening, as Thomas walked his fields in the fading light, He carried both the restored pocket watch and the knowledge that the Mercer agricultural legacy would continue not unchanged, but adapted to new conditions while honoring the persistence and stewardship that had sustained it through previous generations of challenge and change. The true treasure hadn't been buried in an underground vault, but in the potential for renewal and growth that had always existed in the land, the community, and the agricultural tradition that connected them across generations. Thomas had discovered not just financial resources but a deeper understanding of legacy, not as a burden to be maintained regardless of cost, but as a living tradition capable of evolution while remaining true to its essential purpose and values. 7 years after discovering the underground vault, Thomas stood before an audience of agricultural students at the State University, sharing insights from his journey as a farmer who had transformed not just his own operation but helped revitalize a regional approach to sustainable agriculture. The auditorium was filled with young people who represented the future of farming, a future that looked dramatically different from the bleak prospects that had faced Thomas before Harold's inheritance changed everything. "The most valuable lesson I've learned," Thomas explained, displaying slides of his farm's transformation, "is that agricultural resilience comes from balancing innovation with tradition. New technology alone won't save family farming, but neither will stubborn adherence to methods that no longer work in today's climate and economic reality." The presentation included drone footage showing the integrated approach. The Mercer farm now employed solar panels powering precision irrigation systems. Livestock rotated through crop fields to build soil fertility naturally. Diverse plantings that reduced pest pressure while improving ecological health. What had once been a struggling monoculture operation fighting against financial collapse had become a thriving demonstration of regenerative agriculture principles. 7 years ago, I was days away from losing everything, Thomas acknowledged with the straightforward honesty that had become his trademark in agricultural education circles. Today, I'm not here to tell you about getting lucky with an inheritance. I'm here to share how that opportunity became a catalyst for reimagining what family farming can be in the 21st century. After the lecture, Thomas met with a small group of graduate students working on innovative financing models for beginning farmers. "The biggest barrier for young people entering agriculture isn't knowledge, it's access to land and capital," explained Maria Chun, whose research focused on community-supported agricultural investment. "Your cooperative model provides valuable insights into alternative approaches." This collaborative work with the university represented another dimension of Harold's legacy that Thomas could never have anticipated. The financial resources discovered in the underground vault had created immediate security, but the true impact had emerged through the educational initiatives, community partnerships, and agricultural innovation that those resources had made possible. Later that afternoon, Thomas participated in a meeting of the Midwest Agricultural Resilience Network, an organization that had grown from the initial Millbrook Cooperative to encompass family farms across 3 states. What had begun as neighbors sharing equipment had evolved into a sophisticated system of knowledge exchange, market development, and policy advocacy that was changing how small and medium-sized farms operated. "The Baxter County Group is launching their processing facility next month," reported Frank Wilson, who had become the network's regional coordinator after semi-retiring from active farming. Their model follows the Millbrook blueprint, but with adaptations for their local conditions and crop mix. This regional expansion represented perhaps the most significant outcome of Thomas's approach to deploying Harold's legacy. Rather than creating an isolated success story, he had developed systems and structures that could be replicated and adapted by other farming communities facing similar challenges. The underground vault's treasure had provided seed funding, but the enduring value came from how those resources catalyzed collaborative innovation. The next morning, Thomas welcomed a delegation from the USD, a Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, to the Mercer Farm. Federal officials were documenting the integrated water management system that had reduced irrigation needs by 60% while improving crop yields and soil health, an approach developed through collaboration between Thomas, university researchers, and neighboring farmers. "What impresses us most," commented Dr. James Rodriguez, the delegation's leader, "is how you've integrated technological innovation with ecological principles. These aren't separate approaches but complementary strategies that reinforce each other." This integration reflected Thomas's evolving philosophy of agricultural sustainability using modern tools and knowledge to work with natural systems rather than against them, applying technology to enhance biological processes rather than replace them, creating farms that were both economically viable and ecologically regenerative. As the delegation toured fields where diverse cover crops grew between production seasons, Thomas explained how the farm's approach had evolved through continuous learning and adaptation. "We're constantly experimenting, measuring outcomes, and refining our methods. This isn't about following a rigid system, but developing approaches that respond to our specific conditions." This commitment to context-specific innovation rather than universal solutions had become a defining characteristic of the agricultural transformation sparked by Harold's legacy. Rather than promoting a single right way to farm, Thomas had fostered a culture of thoughtful experimentation, careful observation, and knowledge sharing that allowed each operation to develop practices suited to its unique circumstances. That evening, Thomas hosted a community dinner at the Agricultural Research and Education Center, bringing together farmers, researchers, students, and local residents to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Millbrook Agricultural Cooperative. The center's main hall had been transformed with tables featuring dishes prepared from locally grown ingredients, showcasing the diversity and quality of the region's agricultural production. "When we started this journey," Thomas remarked during his brief welcome address, "many of us were struggling in isolation, each farm fighting its own battle against economic forces that seemed overwhelming. Today, we're demonstrating that collaboration creates possibilities that none of us could achieve alone." The gathered community represented the multifaceted impact of the approach Thomas had pioneered: family farms operating with renewed viability, young people finding sustainable careers in agriculture, researchers developing locally adapted solutions to global challenges, and a regional food system providing both economic and nutritional benefits to the broader community. After dinner, Thomas walked through the center's research fields with Sarah Thompson, who had joined the cooperative 3 years earlier after returning to farming from a corporate career. "I never thought I'd be able to reclaim my family's farm," she commented as they observed trial plots comparing different intercropping combinations. "The conventional wisdom was that small operations like ours couldn't survive anymore." "Conventional wisdom is often based on conditions that can change," Thomas replied, articulating the perspective that had guided his approach to agricultural innovation. "The question isn't whether small farms can survive in today's environment, but how that environment itself might be transformed through collaboration and strategic innovation." This perspective that seemingly fixed constraints could be reimagined through collective action and thoughtful strategy represented perhaps the most profound aspect of Harold's legacy. The underground vault had provided financial resources, but Thomas's deployment of those resources had demonstrated how apparently insurmountable challenges could be addressed through approaches that changed the fundamental conditions rather than merely responding to them. 10 years after discovering the vault beneath Harold's garden shed, Thomas participated in the groundbreaking ceremony for the Millbrook Food Innovation Center, a facility that would enable local farmers to process and add value to their products while creating new employment opportunities in the community. The center represented the latest evolution of the cooperative approach, extending beyond primary production to create a more integrated regional food system. This facility embodies our commitment to capturing more of the value chain within our community, Thomas explained to visiting officials from the Economic Development Administration, whose grant had partially funded the construction. Rather than shipping raw commodities elsewhere for processing, we're creating finished products that return more economic benefit to the farmers and workers who produce them. This emphasis on value-added production and regional market development had emerged as a central strategy in the cooperative's approach to agricultural resilience. By processing raw materials locally, farmers could capture a larger share of consumer food dollars while creating employment opportunities that strengthened the broader rural economy. As Thomas watched construction equipment break ground for the new facility, he reflected on how differently Harold's legacy had unfolded than anyone could have anticipated. The financial treasure discovered in the underground vault had indeed transformed his personal circumstances, but the true value had emerged through the collaborative initiatives, educational programs, and structural innovations that those resources had made possible. The Mercer farm had evolved from a struggling operation on the verge of foreclosure to a thriving demonstration of integrated agricultural systems that balanced productivity with ecological health. But more significantly, it had become part of a regional network that was changing how small and medium-sized farms operated, creating viable alternatives to both industrial agriculture and subsistence farming. Later that week, Thomas hosted a delegation from an international agricultural development organization, studying models for rural economic revitalization. The visitors had specifically requested to learn about the Millbrook approach after reading case studies documenting its success in creating economically viable small-scale farming operations. "The principle that most interests us," explained Dr. Maria Hernandez, the delegation's leader, "is how you've balanced individual farm autonomy with collective action. Many cooperative models sacrifice one for the other, but you seem to have found a productive middle ground. This balance, maintaining independence while creating structures for mutual benefit, had indeed become a hallmark of the approach Thomas had developed. Participating farms maintained their distinct identities and decision-making authority while accessing shared resources, knowledge, and market opportunities that none could create alone. We've learned that effective collaboration doesn't require standardization," Thomas explained as they toured the equipment sharing facility where specialized machinery was maintained for use by cooperative members. "The strongest systems respect individual differences while creating platforms for common benefit." This philosophy extended beyond equipment sharing to encompass marketing arrangements, research priorities, and educational programming. Rather than imposing uniform approaches, the cooperative created frameworks within which diverse operations could find appropriate resources and opportunities while contributing their unique perspectives and experiences. 15 years after inheriting Harold's property, Thomas stood in a classroom at the Millbrook Agricultural Education Center, teaching a course on farm business planning to a group that included both experienced farmers transitioning to sustainable practices and young people entering agriculture for the first time. The center had evolved into a nationally recognized training facility, attracting students from across the country interested in regenerative farming approaches. "Financial viability isn't separate from ecological health," Thomas explained, displaying analyses that demonstrated the economic benefits of integrated farming systems. "When we work with natural processes rather than against them, we often find that profitability improves alongside environmental outcomes." This integration of economic and ecological perspectives had become central to the educational approach Thomas had developed. Rather than treating financial and environmental considerations as competing priorities, the curriculum demonstrated how thoughtfully designed agricultural systems could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. After class, Thomas met with the center's leadership team to review plans for the coming year's programs. The facility had expanded beyond its initial focus on technical training to include courses on cooperative development, regional food system creation, and agricultural policy, a comprehensive approach to building capacity for sustainable rural economies. "The demand for our beginning farmer program has increased by 40% this year," reported Elena Martinez, the center's education director. We're seeing interest from people with diverse backgrounds, many with no prior agricultural experience, but strong commitment to creating more resilient food systems. This growing interest in sustainable agriculture careers represented another dimension of the transformation Harold's legacy had helped catalyze. By demonstrating viable alternatives to conventional farming approaches, the Millbrook model was attracting new participants to agriculture at a time when the average farmer age was increasing nationally and many rural communities were losing population. The following day, Thomas welcomed visitors to the Mercer Farm's annual field day, where hundreds of farmers, researchers, and agricultural professionals gathered to observe demonstrations of innovative practices and exchange knowledge about sustainable farming approaches. What had begun as a small neighborhood gathering had evolved into a significant regional event that showcased the collaborative learning culture that had developed. 15 years ago, I was days away from selling this farm, Thomas acknowledged during his opening remarks. Today, we're not celebrating my individual success, but the collective resilience we've built together. This transformation wasn't the result of one person's efforts or resources, but the commitment of an entire community to reimagining what rural agriculture can be. This perspective, that meaningful change required collective action rather than isolated heroics, reflected the deepest wisdom Thomas had derived from his unexpected journey. Harold's underground vault had provided financial resources that created immediate possibilities, but the enduring legacy had emerged through how those resources were deployed to strengthen connections, build capacity, and create systems that extended far beyond any individual farm. As Thomas moved through the demonstration areas, engaging with visitors who had traveled from across the country to learn from the Millbrook approach, he reflected on how differently his life had unfolded than he could have imagined on that desperate morning when he first received the letter about Harold's inheritance. The financial treasure had indeed transformed his material circumstances, but the true wealth had emerged through the relationships, knowledge, and collective capacity that had developed in response to that initial opportunity. The Mercer Farm continued to thrive, not as an isolated success story, but as part of an integrated regional system where diverse operations supported each other through shared resources, knowledge exchange, and collective market development. The financial security provided by Harold's collection had created the foundation, but the lasting legacy was the community of mutual support and innovation that had grown from that initial investment. 20 years after discovering the underground vault, Thomas sat on his farmhouse porch with his nephew Michael, who had recently joined the operation after completing the agricultural education program at the state university. The young man represented the next generation of Mercer, farming knowledgeable about both traditional practices and cutting-edge innovations, committed to ecological stewardship while understanding the economic realities of agricultural production. "I've been studying the farm's records from before the transformation," Michael commented, referring to the period when Thomas had struggled against mounting debt and market pressures. "It's hard to imagine how close this place came to being lost." Thomas nodded, remembering the desperation of those days when each bill payment required impossible choices and the future had seemed to offer nothing but inevitable failure. "What saved this farm wasn't just financial resources," he replied, articulating the wisdom that 20 years of reflection had crystallized. "It was learning to see possibilities beyond the constraints that seemed fixed and unchangeable." This capacity to envision alternatives to seemingly inevitable outcomes had become perhaps the most valuable aspect of Harold's legacy, not just the financial resources discovered in the underground vault, but the example of foresight and strategic thinking that had preserved value through changing conditions and created opportunities where others saw only limitations. As evenings settled over fields that remained productive after generations of cultivation, Thomas handed the pocket watch to his nephew, the same watch that had been sold out of necessity and later recovered. Its inscription, "Fortune favors the persistent," now carrying layers of meaning that transcended its original intent. The true lesson of this farm story, Thomas said as Michael examined the heirloom, isn't about getting lucky with an unexpected discovery. It's about recognizing that persistence means more than just enduring difficult conditions. Sometimes it means reimagining what's possible and finding new paths forward when old approaches no longer work. This understanding that adaptation required not abandoning core values, but finding new ways to express them in changing circumstances represented the enduring wisdom that had emerged from Thomas's unexpected journey. The underground vault had contained financial treasure that transformed his material circumstances, but the true inheritance had been the capacity to see beyond apparent limitations and create possibilities that extended far beyond any individual benefit. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.